There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union.
He's attacking! Gotta watch, get him!
You have to see the special man.
I found a place where we can put up a cabin.
I'd like to see it.
When you've got to go places where the road comes later, whistle for the 1985 Toyota 4x4. The most powerful small truck ever built, with the highest running ground clearance of any small 4x4. No wonder it's the best-selling small 4x4 in America.
They plan to put a road in?
You care?
In June 1982, Hissène Habré came to power in the African nation of Chad. Habré escaped exile in Sudan and resumed his long-lasting fight with the Chadian government. The Libyan-backed government of President Francois Tombalbaye was ousted. Habré had major support from the U.S. government and the Central Intelligence Agency. The U.S. intelligence service saw Habré's regime as a politically convenient alliance to stand against Chad's neighbor to the north, Libya, and its enigmatic leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi fully supported the regime of Francois Tombalbaye and even struck a deal to purchase the Azu Strip. The strip of land separates the southern border of Libya and the northern border of Chad. Gaddafi sought to control this space not only to provide a defensive buffer zone for southern Libya, but also because it was rumored to have uranium deposits. Gaddafi refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new CIA-backed government in southern Chad. Goukouni Wede was head of the Transitional Government of National Unity, which drew much of its support from the Libyans and was based in northern Chad. The Transitional Government of National Unity was a kind of government in exile and wanted to oust Habré from power. It was made up of multiple different tribal and ethnic factions, combined with leftovers of Tombalbaye's ousted government. Gaddafi wanted the transitional government back in power so they could honor the agreement over Libyan control of the Azu Strip. France also backed Habré and agreed to send arms and equipment to his government. France did not recognize any claims that Gaddafi had to the Azu Strip and even agreed to provide air support to southern Chad if tensions were to break out into war with the Northern Transitional Government and Libya. France made an agreement with Libya in 1984, and Libya agreed to remove its forces from northern Chad. Libya routinely broke the agreement and kept forces in Chad anyway. By 1986, tensions were still hot, and the Transitional Government of National Unity under Wede was fracturing. Habré and Southern Chadians saw the breaking of the Northern Alliance as an opportunity to divide the factions and strengthen its position. One by one, each separate group was brought into the government fold, and the alliance between the Transitional Government of National Unity and Libya also crumbled. The loss of the support from the now faltering transitional government had terrible consequences for the Libyans in the coming conflict. A force that was used to being in a supporting role now had to take to the front lines. By early 1987, Habré and his forces launched towards the northern half of the country to oust the Libyans. Part of France's aid to the Chadian government was shipments of Toyota trucks. The two models mostly used were the Toyota Helix and the Toyota Land Cruiser. Chad lacked much in the way of hard military equipment. Their soldiers were mostly veterans and were hardy fighters used to a harsh desert terrain. However, without vehicles and anti-tank rockets, they had little chance of breaking the Soviet T-55 tanks mostly used by Gaddafi's army. The Toyotas were outfitted with anti-tank rockets, heavy machine guns, and all manner of heavy artillery. Trucks would also be used as fast personnel carriers and reconnaissance vehicles. The trucks had excellent gas mileage and were plentiful. Many in the country were requisitioned by the government and put into service. The Chadians had as many as between 400 to 500 of these trucks in service, and they proved to be formidable in their hands. Many of the Libyan veterans were people known as the Goran. The Goran mostly hailed from the region of Tibetsi. They are known for their skills as cavalrymen, scouts, and for surviving in a very harsh climate. A French officer observing much of the fighting quipped, "They are mounted on Toyotas instead of horses." The Chadians also discovered that when brought to a high rate of speed, the Toyota Helix could drive over a minefield without setting off any of the deadly explosives. They also discovered that these fast-moving vehicles were difficult to target by the Libyan tanks. The pickups could ride around the tanks and swarm them in a hail of fire. Mounted anti-tank rounds could then target the vulnerable parts of the tanks and destroy them. Libya's military was comprised mostly of inexperienced and unmotivated soldiers. Training was not up to par. and many had little to no motivation to fight a war of expansion for Gaddafi. They were, however, heavily armed, with some of the best Soviet equipment Gaddafi could acquire. The army had tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, helicopters, and jet fighters. Unfortunately, many in the army were not trained to use much of this equipment. The leadership of the Libyan army was also poor. Many of the commanders on the Libyan side were appointed by Gaddafi himself, and loyalty was prized above merit. Gaddafi worried constantly about plots against him, and he obsessively watched his military for dissidents. Nowhere in the conflict was the superiority of the Chadian mobile forces more on display than at the fight over the Quad-e-Dum. The Quad-e-Dum was Libya's main air force base and gave most of the Libyan forces its air cover and reconnaissance support. In March of 1987, a small force of Chadians assaulted the air force base. They destroyed most of the heavy equipment defending the airfields and swarmed its defenders. The Chadians drove over the minefields in high speeds and seized the airfield with minimal casualties. The loss was a disaster for the Libyans. Many of their fleeing soldiers were forced to run through minefields to escape the carnage. The Libyans ultimately had to abandon the area and even destroy most of their remaining equipment to prevent its capture. A Chadian officer, when asked whether the trucks would be effective against the Libyans, believed to be a first-rate modern army, said, "I'm not sure. We weren't fighting a first-rate army." Another Chadian officer, when asked how they were able to have such success, so quickly stated emphatically, "We just charged them, that's all." Gaddafi's forces were now isolated in harsh terrain and lacking any air cover. The loss of the airfield proved to be too much for the Libyans, and their forces were being routed in nearly every engagement. Gaddafi announced the Libyans were leaving Chad. Gaddafi, in either complete delusion or to save face, declared victory. With the Libyan army thoroughly beaten, the Chadians decided to take the fight to the enemy. In August 1987, the Chadians launched an offensive into the Azu Strip. The fleet of Toyotas rode into the town of Azu and occupied it. The Libyan response was to begin a bombing campaign in the Strip, and this time, aircraft flew beyond the range of Chad's air defenses. Chad appealed to France for further aid to continue the offensive into Libya itself, and France declined. France feared this would truly offset the balance of power and refused to give the offensive its blessing. The Chadians relied heavily on steady supplies from the French, and with that declarations, Chadians could expect very little. The Americans, however, were more keen on the idea of a Libyan invasion. It signaled that they would help where they could. Azu was retaken by Libyan forces with a surprise counterattack. Libyans began using smaller vehicles such as jeeps to match the Chadian tactics, and this proved effective. Abre, still seeking to make pushes into Libya, ordered an attack on a large air force base at Matan al-Sara. Hassan Jammu launched into the air base in a strike similar to the Quad-e-Dum earlier in the year. The Libyans proved yet again to be unmotivated, unprepared, and gullible. Libyan forces were drawn out and confused by Chadian troop movements purposely designed to confuse and throw off Libyan intelligence. No one knew when or from what direction the attack would come, and this spread the Libyan forces thin. With the aid of American satellite intelligence, they rushed the base and secured yet another masterful victory. They destroyed everything they could not carry and sent yet more fleeing soldiers into Libya. When the Chadians left the air base, it was unusable. This victory strengthened Abre's resolve to take the fight to Libya. The French government, seeing this victory as now signaling a Libyan invasion was imminent, asked for negotiations between Libya and Chad. A ceasefire was signed in September 1987 under intense diplomatic pressure from France and the Organization of African Unity, which mediated. Gaddafi recognized the legitimacy of Abre's government in 1988. 6 years later, in 1994, the International Court of Justice recognized Chad as the legitimate owners of the Azu Strip, and Libya fully withdrew by the middle of the year. The Toyota War showed that small-cost technology like Toyota trucks could prove to be deadly in the hands of the right fighters, and with the proper tactics employed. Fast-moving insurgencies with even limited funding could acquire these hardy machines and use them for all manner of military purposes. Toyota Helixes and Land Cruisers are still seen today in irregular warfare worldwide. With Libya's defeat in the Toyota War, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's army was exposed. Lack of training, morale, and leadership could not be overcome by lavish weapons. Gaddafi, before this conflict, saw himself as North Africa's strongest military, and he commanded respect and fear. After the Toyota War, his international standing in that regard took a major blow, and arguably, never recovered.